I'm Jack Langdon. I was originally born in Madison, Wisconsin, and grew up in a small town north of Madison. Uh, I spent a couple of years living in Minnesota during my undergrad. I'm currently quarantining in Chicago, but normally I would be in the area near Vermont and New Hampshire, studying for my master's at Dartmouth. I'm a composer. I am also a multi-instrumentalist. My main instrumental focus is the pipe organ and the electric guitar.
Wow. I realize you're a multi-instrumentalist.
Yeah, I also dabble beyond that. I would not say that I'm a virtuoso at any of them, but I get the job done.
Yeah, and I've seen, there's a performance of a piece of yours where you're playing piano.
Yes,
So yet another instrument. Okay. Okay. Very,
absolutely. Keyboard area,
yeah.
anything I can get my hands on, I would say.
Good. Toy piano, fake piano. um,
Absolutely.
so how'd you get into music?
Yeah, I think for me, like growing up, I did not grow up in a musical family. I went to church and my parents sang. My parents are both lovers of music for sure, very diverse taste and whatnot. But the sort of like musical culture that I think a lot of my peers grew up in was very, very foreign to me. I was never like a youth orchestra kid. I didn't, go to festivals when I was in high school and whatnot. But for me, music was always sort of this like side world that I lived in as sort of an escape and a bit of an area where I could really like focus my energy and get very deep into my interests, and just allowed myself to sort of daydream of all of the different things that weren't school or working or anything like that. So I think my sort of beginning musical experiences were very, very isolated, very much in the kind of like cliche of the sort of like the lone composer, the
Okay.
anti uh, hates humanity or whatever strange narrative you want to put on top of that. But I think being sort of the like moody high schooler and having my own little world as a composer, imagining pieces that I never thought would get performed was a very like sort of an interesting I think angle to my coming of age, because especially as I've gotten older, I desired music as this social phenomenon, but my beginning experiences in music were actually the exact antithesis of that. Yeah, very self-taught. Very much an autodidact, I think. We would kind of walk around thrift shops and try and collect, kind of beginner used instruments, and had a
Mm.
flute, had a clarinet. The few instruments that I had been trained on formally, I played guitar for quite a long time, classically, played tuba since I was in elementary school. So I just sort of developed this like more experimental, spending a little bit of time learning the basics of each of these instruments, and then kind of getting into a more idiomatic, uh, sort of personal way of approaching each of them. And I think that that's kind of continued in both my performing ethic, but also how I approach composition.
Um, why don't you talk a little bit about something that might be important to you, that's important in your life that has nothing to do with music, or if there is something that sort of operates separately from music, but is just, really
Uh,
important to you.
Definitely. There are a couple of things I think that pop up sort of serving a similar purpose for me, that music, is a great level of my life that gives me a lot of joy and, interest and whatnot. But aside from that, I think photography for sure.
Hmm.
That's something that just as long as I've been a musician, I've also been an amateur photographer and videographer. And I think for me, like maybe in a similar way, but from a different angle, it gives me this sort of perspective on my own history as a human and my own placement in the world. Certainly from a physical standpoint. I mean, when I'm, you know, here taking a photo and I get time to uh, capture that moment and then look at it from a different point in time. I think that there's like a level of truth and objectivity that you get to experience that you wouldn't necessarily have being in the moment. And I think the same is sort of true with composition, where, not necessarily from the objective standpoint, but there's this ability to sort of turn around your own subjectivity from a different place in time and, re-examine the sort of emotions that perhaps you were feeling, or even just the influences that you had. And I think in general, finding things that give me perspective on the sort of chaotic nature that we find ourselves in navigating the world as human subjects is definitely something that I find really, really fascinating and gives me a lot of wellness and grounding. I would say just as important, if not more important than that, is sort of my ongoing interest in politics and philosophy, especially. And again, kind of from maybe another angle that's a little bit more complicated to express, is just this idea that as a composer, I'm dealing primarily with the subjective, and maybe over the span of many years, becoming more aware of how I'm existing subjectively in reality. Photography and field recording, I would kind of connect to this as a way to get just a very like reductive and objective way of seeing, at this point, I was witnessing this site or this environment in field recording. But politics for me, and philosophy going along with that, I feel like kind of allows me to make sense of myself in the context of things that are far more chaotic and large, and allows me to understand the context of why things end up in the way that they are in terms of the economy and in terms of all of the social situations that I find myself in that, frankly, oftentimes are just absolutely bewildering and hard to really understand from the subjective or the objective standpoint. Writing on politics helps me kind of imagine, well, if there's this problem that we see in the social fabric of whatever context I find myself in, what's a better way of understanding this, or what's the deeper truth underneath that? And that also, I think, feeds back in between all these different these other disciplines that I engage with. Connected to the issue of we're in the business of creating experiences that become highly subjective. That's the nature of putting art into the world, and I think that even to some degree, politics is very much the same way.
Yeah,
it's really not. It's not something that can be explained by economic modeling per se, or even sort of like archetypal narratives, but it becomes something that's much more unwieldy. And I think that that's a very interesting perspective to be creating things in, but it's also, it's very messy, and I'm fully for getting into the messy.
Is there anything in particular sort of moving forward in your life that you really feel is important, is an important value for you?
Yeah. You thinking artistically or generally? I guess they could overlap, I suppose.
They could overlap. I often find that they're oddly connected.
They are. They are. And if they're not, then there's probably a problem. Yeah, I think something that I'm really, I don't know, in an idealistic way, I dream about quite a bit is just there's a power about making art that I think under ideal circumstances creates a very beautiful common ground between people of very, very different backgrounds and different experiences. It certainly can be the opposite. It can be a very particular thing that intentionally puts an energy between people. I'm not as interested in that personally. A lot of my formative experiences, especially coming from somebody who made music in their basement and then realized that there are a community of people that want to make strange noises and want to really deeply connect with each other through the process of putting art out in the world, and have an experimental and humble attitude about that. I think I'm interested as an artist in creating more ground for this precise phenomenon to happen within my own work, but I think even broader than that, connected to some of my beliefs in politics and whatnot. I think that there's a lot of work to be done too in thinking of institutions that facilitate these types of experiences, even on the very local level. You know, I had the fortunate experience of teaching at a community music school in Evanston, Illinois for a few years. The musical offering is what it's called. And I was really kind of taken aback by how really just simple acts of providing space for experimentation in a musical context can really open up creative avenues that I think for people that didn't grow up having Stockhausen played by somebody in the household, it becomes very evident that that desire to go beyond what is familiar is actually not a particularity. Like, that is a desire that I think is latent within everybody. And I just imagine if more places and more spaces where this type of exploration were really encouraged, what would the musical world look like? You know, what would intersections between styles that were formerly hardly delineate, how would those disappear, and what type of beautiful social formations might grow out of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much. This has been great. I really appreciate it. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Kurt.